Welcome to the McMaster Alumni Association's virtual bus tour to Stratford. Although we couldn't get together in person for this annual day of learning and theater, we are thrilled to be able to do so virtually. We are grateful that Kel and Allan Pero agreed to be part of our day, and that the Stratford Festival has made available the film of their 2014 performance of King John through their Stratford at Home series in lieu of the 2020 season. Our speakers today are Kel and Allan Pero. They live in Stratford, Ontario, and have enriched the theater experience for several McMaster alumni guests on both the Stratford and Shaw Festival trips. Allan is an associate professor of English and the director of the Centre for the Study of Theory and Criticism at the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario. He is also editor-in-chief of English Studies in Canada. He is a co-editor and a contributor to The Many Facades of Edith Sitwell, 2017. Recent publications include articles on Wyndham Lewis, Blachon and Lacan, Lacan and the Posthuman, Ford Madox Ford, and Bridget Brophy. He is currently working on an encyclopedia of cultural theory with Kel Pero for the University of Toronto Press, and on a book-length project on camp and modernism. Kel Pero holds a PhD in English literature and is the owner of KMP and Associates Creative Communications Services. She is a proud member of ACTRA and Canadian Actors Equity, and was a co-founder of Ottawa theatre company Plosion Productions. Kel has done program notes and given lectures for the Stratford Festival for 15 years, including the notes for the play that they will be speaking about today, Shakespeare's King John. Welcome, Kel and Allan.
Hello. Hello, everybody, and thank you for that lovely introduction. We are here today with you virtually to talk about Shakespeare's King John, and as was mentioned, you will get the chance to see a very good film version of the 2014 production after this. And so I'm going to be talking at first a bit about the background and context for King John. I hope that will be of interest and use to some people as you kind of go to see the production. It's often helpful to know a bit about the background. And Allan, what will you be talking about?
Well, I'll start talking more about the play proper and some things you might want to think about while you're watching the film.
Okay. Well, the first thing that I'd like to say to start out is that obviously we're all together today in this rather unusual way because things are kind of bad right now. And in the West, we are really not used to dealing with something like a pandemic, an outbreak of disease that we can't contain. And that's actually something that, of course, would have been much more familiar to Shakespeare and his audience. So perhaps we can console ourselves somewhat with a certain fellow feeling with that because of that. And something else that we're not familiar with in the modern West is living under monarchs who both reign and rule. And by that, I mean they both sit on the throne, as, for example, Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom does right now, and they rule. They have actual say in and impact on the law and governance of a country. Now, if you're living in the Commonwealth, if you're in Spain or Norway or Denmark, Belgium, any number of countries, you're used to living under a constitutional monarchy. The monarchy model in which the monarch is purely a figurehead, head of state, opens things, cuts ribbons, things like that, opens parliament, but does not, again, have any actual impact on the law and government of a country. And if you live under an absolute monarchy, you're probably living either in one of the Middle Eastern countries or in Swaziland in Africa. Those are the only places outside of Vatican City. Vatican City is actually considered an absolute monarchy that still have absolute monarchies right now. Now, Shakespeare in his time lived under not actually an absolute monarchy, but certainly a monarchy in which the monarch reigned and ruled. And that meant that whoever was sitting on the throne and the more powerful members of the nobility really did matter, not just because they were wealthy and people are rather impressed by that, but because the decisions they made and the things they did tended to have an actual impact on ordinary people living in their territories. The monarch obviously was the ruler of all the people in the country, but for instance, in Shakespeare's time, there were powerful dukes and earls whose holdings were really like fiefdoms. They had sometimes more influence and more direct power than the monarch might have, depending often on how far they were from London and from the seat of central government. So kings and queens were good material for Shakespeare when he was writing plays because obviously they did represent the kind of power and wealth that has always been fascinating to us in storytelling terms, but also because while you might never see the monarch, that person actually, did things that could have an impact on your life. Now, at the time, for most of Shakespeare's life, not for all of it, Elizabeth I was on the throne. She was the last of the 5 Tudor monarchs. The Tudor monarchy began in the 1480s with Henry VII. She was the 5th and last Tudor monarch. And when Henry VII had come to the throne, frankly, his claim to the throne was not great. And the Tudors actually spent a good deal of energy trying to encourage the notion that they were very much to be identified with England's glorious past, with the legend of King Arthur, for example. And the idea was that if they could really make people identify them enough with England's glorious monarchical past, it would sort of make them feel more like they belonged, and more importantly, it would make the people around them feel like they had a legitimate claim to the throne. So, pardon me. So the notion of who was on the throne and what kind of right that person had to be there was actually a pretty important question in Shakespeare's time. Now, I don't mean to suggest that the average person woke up in the morning thinking, does Elizabeth I really have the right to sit on the throne, and that person was going to be able to spend a good deal of intellectual energy thinking about it, because then, even more than now, the vast majority of people were just trying to survive the day without, getting a cut that might get infected and kill you, for example. The notion of just surviving day to day was a very, very immediate thing to people in Shakespeare's time. But nevertheless, if you look at Shakespeare and the kings that he wrote about, you notice that, you have King Lear, who is a figure of legend, a figure in the mist. He's not somebody who people would associate with the English throne in the way that they would associate Elizabeth I in her time with the English throne. He writes about him. He also has a streak right from Richard II in the late 14th century, right through to Richard III, Richard to Richard, bookends. And all his history plays in there deal with things like the Wars of the Roses. Now, when Shakespeare's audience was enjoying him at his height, so let's say, the 1590s when King John was probably written, people would not have had an immediate memory of something like the Wars of the Roses, but it was a shadow. It was not something that was terribly remote and I think didn't mean anything to people. The notion of what it meant to have a monarch on the throne who either was just incompetent or who was a usurper, that was somebody who had illegitimately taken the throne when he shouldn't have. Those questions were important because if you had a king whom God was not happy to have on the throne, and remember, monarchs were anointed and were considered to be sent by God, ordained by God, you really wanted people to buy into that because that had a lot to do with legitimacy. You had people who were sitting on the throne and shouldn't be, and or people who were incompetent. You tended to get things like war, a lot of war. War is bad for the common man and woman. Right? And of course, the irony about that is that, right back to the Roman emperors, and really it did carry through certainly at least Henry VIII, the notion that a monarch was made by war was something that stuck very strongly, really throughout Europe. And monarchs tended to like to go to war. Not somebody like Elizabeth. Elizabeth I did not like to go to war, and you know why? It was because it was costly, and she was very aware of how much money her father, Henry VIII, had run through, frankly, when he was on the throne. His father, Henry VII, kind of a low-key king, built up the treasury. Henry VIII was all about pomp and circumstance and shows of power, and so he went through a lot of it. By the time came around to Elizabeth, she was not so keen. But all to say, the majority of the history plays that we generally see from Shakespeare are ones that are very concerned with the notion of, what happens if we don't have a good monarch? The fact that person again, could make decisions that could wipe out you and your family. That's pretty important. It's not like you said, well, if we can make it through the next 5 years, we can have an election and get rid of this guy and maybe elect his son. Of course, that was not the case. So with a play like King John is a kind of an interesting outlier because King John obviously was a historically attested to figure. There is no question that he existed and that he actually did sit on the throne. But by the time Shakespeare's audience came around, Shakespeare himself came around, King John had been gone for a long time. He died in 1216, and even by Shakespeare's time, his reputation as a bad king had been pretty much set. So that did a few good things for Shakespeare. It meant he had a king about whom to write, always good to entertainment value. The entertainment value could be particularly mined because John was enough out of, shall we say, public memory that you didn't have to worry, for example, about critique there being felt by the current occupant of the Monarch. Shakespeare's play Richard II, a little later on, actually became imbricated in the Essex Rebellion against Elizabeth. I am Richard II, know ye not that, she said. That kind of got to be a touchy thing. And of course, if you were a playwright who just wanted to write his plays and get people to come and see them, you didn't want trouble, especially from the crown, right? So John was not identified that closely with current affairs that you had to be too careful what you said about him. And as well, John was would have been seen as in a somewhat more exotic light than, let's say, someone like Richard III, because John was in many respects still a Norman king. He was still seen as part of that then fairly long ago history that really connected the English and the French thrones quite closely. And so he could also be associated with that the kind of corruption that the English like to fancy was kind of native to places like France and Italy and so forth. So it was John was a pretty good subject all around for Shakespeare. So who was John and how did he come to the throne? Well, there are actually a lot of really interesting and colorful family groups if you look at the whole history of the English throne. But I think you'd probably go a long way to beat Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II, John's parents. Eleanor herself is certainly one of the most remarkable, and I know Alan is going to say more about her later, but she's one of the most colorful and remarkable women in English history, period, much less English monarchical history. And Henry sometimes, I think, suffers a bit in comparison with her. She lived a long life. She had 2 children by her first husband and about 8 or 10 by Henry himself. She was several years older than Henry. And they had married at least partly for love. They decided they wanted to be together. That didn't end up working out so well. But, that's not a new story either, I guess. But a part of their large family was King John. Now, they had 5 sons, and John was the youngest of the 5. The oldest, William, only lived to be about 3, but the others all lived to adulthood, Henry, Geoffrey, and Richard. One of the things that's notable about this period in English history, which is the late 12th century, is that the notion of primogeniture, that is, the firstborn son inherits, was not really as set in stone as it became. And it particularly wasn't really a thing with the Normans. They were not, they did not want to be bound to that. And part of that was because what we think of now as France was really divided up into a number of powerful, more and less powerful duchies, depending on where you were, and a number of kingdoms that people kept on trying to kind of carve and recarve. You're going to marry so-and-so, so I'm going to give you this duchy, but now I'm going to march against you and try to take it back. So-and-so has died, so we're going to take that. It was like a puzzle that never ended. You had all the pieces, but as soon as it was like the pieces were made of kittens. As soon as you put them in one place, off they went. So the Normans were more keen, especially if you were kind of lucky, like Henry was, and you had 4 sons who lived to adulthood. I don't even know what the odds of that were. Actually, almost all of their kids, I think, except William, actually lived to be adults, which is just amazing. If you had 4 sons and you had England and you had parts of France, as certainly Henry did, you might want to kind of split the sons up and be able to put them in different places while you were still alive. And one of the really remarkable things, the only time in English history that there have been 2 kings at once, has been when Henry II was alive and his son Henry, who was known as Henry the Young King, was also crowned King of England. Henry II didn't let Henry Jr. do much of anything after that. That came to kind of annoy young Henry after a while, and he started this hearty tradition in the family of rebelling against his father. But nevertheless, he had this young man crowned, so he thought, okay, I've got a placeholder there in England. He made Geoffrey Duke of Brittany. He looked at Richard I, who is better known as Richard Coeur d'Allion or Coeur de Lion, Richard Lionheart. He thought, okay, that's a pretty good guy maybe to succeed me. But then there was the youngest, John. And again, I know you're going to talk more about John, but I will say this. It was observed in Henry II's time that his youngest son, John, seemed to very much have his heart. And I think it's safe to say that John was just a little bit spoiled as a result of that. Everything that Henry saw, he thought he wanted for John. Now, what are the chances of when you're the youngest of originally 5, and let's say practically speaking 4 boys, that you are, if your father is king, what are the chances that you're going to become king? They're pretty slender. What you are generally going to do is you're maybe going to make a reasonably advantageous marriage with someone with whom your father wants to make some peace or with whom he wants to have a closer connection, or you are going to enter the church whether you like it or not. You're going to be a priest. That would have been a much, much more typical role for John. But partly because primogeniture was not the order of the day, so Henry wanted to use his different sons in different ways, and partly because John just managed to survive eventually to survive all his brothers, he got to be king. So that in itself makes him quite remarkable. Now, what kind of king was he? Well, the general consensus up until very recently, from almost, from his own time really, but it started to settle. It's easier to criticize people in this way, obviously, after they're dead. But the general consensus was that John was not a great king. He first of all was responsible for losing quite a bit of the French territory that his father had held, even though, as I said, trying to hold on, there must be, I don't know, I can't think of one immediately, but there must be something. Trying to hold on to something is like trying to hold on to territory in France. There must have been a saying of that sort, at least at one point, because again, it was just musical kingdoms, But he was responsible for losing quite a bit of the French territory. He was seen by many of his contemporaries as being too fond of and too cowed by the French monarchy. He was actually called John Softsword at times because of that. And I'll leave the implications of that to you, because I'm sure not all of them were just about war and power, but he was called that. So, there was a certain amount of contempt for him at the time. He was also known as John Lackland, which was a nickname that was given to him early. Some say his father gave him that nickname because as the youngest son, it's like, well, he lacked land. When was he going to have any land? But once he got some land, he managed to lose a lot of it, which I guess was very consistent, at least. He also was a remarkably tone-deaf person, I guess you'd say, in terms of the way he couldn't read a room, or he chose not to. There were times when he could, but for instance, he was actually, his father attempted to make him King of Ireland at one point. The Pope said no to that, but he did make him Lord of Ireland. So the man who was supposed to be running Ireland, because Ireland was seen to kind of, it was a package deal. If you got England, you got Ireland thrown in as well. I'm Irish, so I won't say any more about that, but I will say that when John went there first with a number of retainers and some advisors, he didn't make a good impression. He laughed at some of the customs and some of the appearances of the kind of native Irish chieftains who were meeting with him. He just didn't do himself any favors, so they kind of got him out of there eventually. That wasn't going to work well. He had a reputation as being kind of capricious. He could be quite cruel. He just wasn't somebody who seemed, in some cases, to care about the impact of the things he said. And of course, he wasn't the first, nor will he be the last leader of one sort or another to be like that. Now, notwithstanding that, he did manage to keep the throne for 17 years. And he also was the signer of Magna Carta, and that's probably the thing for which he's best known. Now, Magna Carta is sometimes represented as sort of the first thing that gave people rights, and that's really an overstatement. What it was that the England that John ruled over was had how would I put this? It was divided into a good number of baronies, and the barons who held them, those baronies, were very powerful men who were responsible for seeing that the monarch's will and the rule of law was covered across the land. Because, of course, if you were in London, most people in the north of England, I mean, that was a long trip at that time. You had to have people who were respected and able to impose authority in places far from wherever you were, whatever your seat of power was, still mostly London at that point, but there were a few other places that monarchs preferred. And of course, France was still really where the king often spent a lot of his time. So getting along with the barons and getting them to do what you wanted was quite important. John didn't manage to do that well either, to the point where the barons rose up and said, this has got to change. And again, the Pope and papal legates got involved. And essentially, Magna Carta was meant to be a kind of almost a Bill of Rights, or at least a bill outlining liberties for the barons. And John did not want to sign it. He was forced to sign it, and then he proceeded to pay no attention to it pretty quickly, and civil war was the result. So, the thing that he's most famous for is certainly not something that he, I think, would have wanted to be famous for. It was not something that he entered into willingly. And he didn't make terribly good use of it, but nevertheless, Magna Carta did become a foundational document of the sort that, in a long, long line later, led to democracy as we now have it. So that's kind of John historically. Now, I'm just going to say a little bit about John in terms of the play, and then I'm going to kind of turn this over to you. And the one thing that I'll say, and you may echo this, I expect, Alan, is that one thing that's really notable about this play, King John, is, well, first of all, it's not much performed these days. We don't have a lot of information on its initial reception history. That is, we're not really sure when it was first written or produced. We know it was probably written sometime in the 1590s, because Holinshed's Chronicle, which was one of the sources for it, was published in 1587. And then about 1598, there was a mention of King John in kind of a list of Shakespeare's plays by Francis Mears. So we know it has to have been written somewhere in there. We're not sure about when it was first produced. It only actually appeared, it was only actually published with the first folio in 1623, by which time, of course, Shakespeare had died. And we just don't have a lot of information about its first, century or so. It then proved quite popular late in the 19th century, almost certainly because it is a play that lends itself very well to pageantry. If you have the budget for great costumes and sets and things like that, and if you do have actors in a few roles, actors and actresses who really kind of want to lean into and choose some scenery, King John's the play for you. It offers that. And then very soon into the 20th century, it kind of dropped out of vogue. The Stratford Festival has produced it about 5 times, so it's actually been pretty fair to John, I guess you'd say. It has kind of put it in rotation. But it's just seemed to be, again, a bit of an outlier among Shakespeare plays. And it's kind of understandable. I mean, when you watch this production, which is a lovely production, one of the things that strikes you about John is that he's not exactly the most important character in the play. The characters of Eleanor and of Constance, John's sister-in-law, and of Philip Falconbridge, the bastard, who probably was an illegitimate son of Richard Cordelian, but not much is known about him, and his name wasn't Falconbridge, as far as anybody knows. Those are the characters that you pay attention to. One of the things about John is that he seems to have no interior life. This is something I noted in the program notes that I did in 2014. Not for John are the heartfelt soliloquies or any kind of confiding to the audience or anything like that. He's purely a public person. We won't give anything away here. We'll let you see what Tom McCamus does with the role, and there are various things one can do with it, but he really doesn't reveal much of himself, which is unusual when you consider both the way Shakespeare tends to approach characters like that, and when you consider that, he is the title character. The play does contain a famous, although perhaps not as famous as it should be, a monologue on the part of Constance, talking about the disappearance of her son, Arthur. That's a whole separate story that we probably don't have time for now, but Constance did predecease Arthur, but Arthur was in fact spirited away and disappeared, probably at John's instigation when he was in his mid-teens. And now this was after he had gone to war against John in Normandy and had lost. So he wasn't a child in our sense, he was a young man. But Constance has her famous speech about, missing him and about his presence still being there, that is often thought possibly to have been inspired by the death of Shakespeare's son, Hamlet. Shakespeare had 3 children, Susanna and then twins, Hamlet and Judith, and Hamlet died when he was about 12. We have no actual way to prove that. It's a thing that because of its timing, probable timing, and because of the tone, seems to give us a connection to Shakespeare personally. So, as I said, we've got this play that has this odd character who's a central character, but not as central as some other characters in this play that is not much produced, about this mercurial and interesting historical figure. And now I'm going to hand it over to Professor Allan Pero to tell you more about that.
Okay, everyone. I'll begin with saying King John is a strange play. And it's strange in part because its events seem not to be shaped by art, but by accident. And what I mean by that is that the characters are much more governed by chance and happenstance, by these dizzying reversals of fortune and decision, than they are, say, by Oscar Wilde's famous definition of fiction, where the good end happily and the bad unhappily. I mean, another way of putting it is to say that King John, besieged by questions of legitimacy and loyalty, is in a way stranger than fiction, and therein, perhaps, resides its truth. So John is, of course, a popular culture figure outside of Shakespeare. We think of evil Prince John in the legends of Robin Hood, who acts as the corrupt regent of Richard the Lionheart, who's off slaughtering away in some crusade. And of course, he appears in The Lion in Winter, the play that was turned into a film, 1968, with Peter O'Toole and Katharine Hepburn. He appears there as a cringing, scheming, self-pitying, scrofulous youngest son of Henry II. And John is an anomaly in some respects, not just as Kel said that, really the idea that John actually became king is in itself miraculous, anomalous, bizarre. But it's that he's also got his mother, Eleanor, who wielded not only political but military power, was also the basis for the figure of the courtly lady in the development of courtly love in the Middle Ages. And of course, we tend to think, when we think about that sort of thing, we think of the courtly lady as this, helpless virginal princess locked away in a tower, awaiting rescue, from her, shining knight. But what's fascinating is that this discourse of, virginal rectitude that informs this idea of the courtly lady has a very strange effect in terms of things like law and truth. For example, as Kel mentioned, Eleanor was first married to Louis VII of France, and after having two daughters with him and no sons, it was annulled, just magically. That's that.
And she and her husband arranged their own annulment.
Exactly.
They worked it out themselves.
So she was, in effect, if I could put it this way, re-virginized, as it were, and ready to marry again. And as she puts it to her sons with Henry II in the line in winter, good Louis, if only I'd managed sons for him instead of little girls, I'd still be stuck being Queen of France, and we should not have married each other. Such, my angels, is the role of sex in history. Yet, when you think about it, she also became a prisoner of Henry II, having been locked away in a tower for 15 years until his death in 1189. Why? Because she engaged with civil wars with him, and as she puts it, I damn near won the last one. So as we see, the courtly lady is locked in a tower, but not by a stubborn father, not by a villainous would-be suitor, but by the man, the king, who loves her. So if the idea of courtly love and that of the courtly lady are the stuff of literature or of romance, we see that they have a basis in reality, but the truth of that reality is very different. The discourse of courtly love is meant to manage and contain femininity. The fact that Eleanor of Aquitaine, John's mother, would become its inspiration seems jarring until you realize that Eleanor herself is that thing that's meant to be managed and contained. And what we discover is that the courtly lady exists really as a masculine fantasy, one that's meant to confine her to a particular set of social functions, wife and mother, but not prince or warrior. So I'd suggest that the reason King John is not just an anomalous historical figure, but an anomalous play, is that there is a masculine anxiety about femininity that dominates the proceedings. That for all the violence and battle of the play, virtually all of it appears and occurs off stage. The questions surrounding legitimacy and truth, which have material effects, of course, on England and France, are played out in domestic terms. This is more the stuff of melodrama. The anxiety about femininity and the power it might wield is very much about family politics, not geopolitics in that way. So one of the hallmarks, of course, of our own giddy age is that there's this fantasy that those in power know what they're doing, that power perforce implies leadership. And of course, we've seen multiple instances in which this has been revealed to be just that, fantasy. It is the truth of our time, an age that some like to call post-truth. Well, in Shakespeare's play, claims to truth and claims to legitimacy are much more in evidence than truth itself. And we come to this realization about the world of King John very quickly when Robert Falconbridge, who's in an argument with his older brother Philip about their inheritance, lays claim to his father's estate because the elder brother is called legitimate. He says, truth is truth. His father, of course, was too far away, gone too long for him to have been truly Philip's father. So how is the situation sorted? Well, in terms of primogeniture, which of course, as Kel said, does not obtain absolutely at this time, but is more and more an expectation, the legitimate son should have the stronger claim. But it is Eleanor who decides to believe that Philip is indeed a bastard and that her son Richard is in fact Philip's father. And the result? Philip is promptly renamed essentially Richard, given a knighthood, and will join Eleanor, now his grandmother, on her incursion into France. John supports this plan, claiming that Falconbridge's will cannot take precedence over the law. In that case, the father's will that his younger son receive the inheritance was overturned by the law, which stated inheritance must go to the eldest son, bastard or not. And what's the implication here? It's that John unwittingly proves his own illegitimate hold on the throne because it's based on will and not on the legal right of succession. So the problem's resolved, but in this utterly arbitrary way. Robert now has his father's land and fortune, and his illegitimate brother has now been elevated. When he confronts his mother, Lady Falconbridge about her infidelity, she admits it, but only when she knows he's renounced his claim to his brother's inheritance. And this is what the bastard says. "Come, lady, I will show thee to my kin, and they shall say, when Richard me begot, if thou hadst said him nay, it had been sin. Who says it was, he lies. I say, 'twas not." So, in a more contemporary translation, what's he saying here? My relatives will say that if you said no to Richard when he conceived me, it would have been a sin. Whoever says it was is lying. I say it was not. How's that for spin doctrine? You see, in Shakespeare's world, when illegitimacy is granted honor and title, you know there's a problem. It is fitting that once Lady Falconbridge has fulfilled her function in legitimizing claim to Philip's illegitimacy, that she disappears into obscurity, where in the logic of the play, she and her desire belong. It should be over there. But this is not the only claim that troubles the proceedings. In fact, the word claim appears a dozen times over in the play. Arthur, the son of Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, of course also a son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, is the legitimate heir to the throne, yet younger brother John rules because Richard placed him there as regent. Arthur's mother, Constance, makes his claim for him. Again, we notice how the domestic sphere has ramifications to the political one. She's persuaded France to support her in her claim, and in a world where claims must constantly be asserted rather than assumed or accepted, they take on a violent aspect. After a certain point, any claim, no matter how legitimate, looks remarkably similar to vengeance. And this is not surprising. When truth becomes arbitrary and fickle, violence will attend virtually any claim. Perhaps this is why the word vengeance, in etymological terms, means to lay claim to. When one wants vengeance, one is really attempting to lay claim to that which has been denied. So given this emphasis on the domestic sphere and this masculine anxiety that informs reigns like John's, and you'll notice when you see the film how mercurial, how manic, how Janus-faced he can be, he will turn on a dime. It should come as no surprise that the great argument about the legitimacy of John and Arthur's claims to the throne is not had by them. It's not had by the nobility. It's had by their respective mothers. Eleanor and Constance trade insults, each questioning the other's fidelity and honor. And it's one of the set pieces of the play, with each woman picnicking on the other. But as we saw with Falconbridge and his bastard brother, legitimacy can be trumped by will. Constance claims that Eleanor is the reason for this confusion, that her sin has grown and multiplied, corrupting all of her family and marking poor innocent Arthur, her son. And she says, "I have but this to say, that he is not only plagued for her sin, but God hath made her sin and her the plague on this removed issue, plague for her, and with her plague. Her sin, his injury, her injury, the beadle to her sin, all punished in the person of this child, and all for her, a plague upon her." And what is she saying? I have this to say, that he is not only punished for her sin, but God has made her sin and her punishment of this child descended from her. She's punished and she punishes him. Her sin harms him, and the harm she does compounds her sin. All the punishment for this sin falls on this child, and all because of her. Damn her. In response, Eleanor claims that she has a will, one that will show that Arthur has been disinherited and that his claim to the throne is a false one. And Constance counters that the only will Eleanor has is a wicked one, a woman's will, a cankered grandam's will. So the fact that Hubert of Angers is then called upon to judge the relative merits of each claim already tells us how dysfunctional this kingdom is. The instability is compounded by Hubert's contention that, well, England and France should, battle each other for the throne, and that Angers will side with the victor. Now, as a form of diplomacy, I think we can safely say this leaves something to be desired. But what's the result? In a world where will is truth, both sides, of course, claim victory. So England and France decide what? To band together, take Angers. Yeah. So now pressed, Hubert turns to this tried and largely true domestic method of resolving the situation, marriage. You know, because marriage has worked so well thus far. At any rate, the French Dauphin or Dolphin, actually the roles, I don't think it's ever actually been played by a Dolphin, by the way, will marry John's niece, Blanche, and give France several provinces as a dowry. Arthur will be given a noble title and all will be well. Yes? No. The noble bastard Philip sees the compromise as weakness and an opportunity to exploit the situation for his own gain. Meanwhile, Constance continues to grieve for her son's lost inheritance. But the proposed solution is further undermined by yet another question of legitimacy. John refuses to recognize the Pope's choice for the Archbishop of Canterbury. Again, will trumps legitimacy. And as a result, the alliance between England and France falls apart, as the papal emissary Pandulf insists that France take arms against John and remove him from the throne. But this decision leads to only more bloodshed, and while Eleanor and the bastard continue the fight in France, Arthur is captured by John's troops. But again, these problems are compounded by a fresh claim. Pandulf convinces Philip, the King of France, that he now has a claim to the English throne and that he has the right to remove John. Fittingly, and you'll know you're in Act 4 when things like this happen, the problems pile on themselves when the two feminine forces in the play, Eleanor and Constance, are reported dead. Arthur, who is to be assassinated under John's orders, is spared, only to die under mysterious circumstances. Did he commit suicide? Was he pushed? Who knows? We have reached the point when what the will decides is truth strikes a truth that cannot be denied, massaged, or even executed. Although John's will that Arthur die does not happen as it should, the fact that it does anyway suggests that will, like a throw of the dice, can never utterly conquer chance. And in the gap between will and chance, we find the truth, a truth whose claims cannot be gainsaid. And John's support, the pledge and seal of his legitimacy, falls away as more and more of his nobles support the French cause. So what can clean up this mess? Two things. And of course, they tell us this in the title, The Life and Death of King John. John's death by poison, and the emergence of a figure who has remained utterly in the shadows until now. Henry, John's legitimate son and heir to the throne. And when Henry comes upon the body of his dying father, he says, "Death, having preyed upon the outward parts, leaves them invisible, and his siege is now against the mind, that which he pricks and wounds with many legions of strange fantasies, which in their throng and pressed to that last hold, confound themselves." The irony here, of course, is that John's siege of the mind began long before he was poisoned. Thanks.
Just something that perhaps I might want to add, one factual thing to clear up in terms of Arthur, the unfortunate young man who, as you say, disappeared under mysterious circumstances, in fact, as well as in the play. He was initially named by Richard I, Richard Lionheart, as his heir. Richard spent almost all of his reign in England on crusade or in France. He spent almost no time in England. He initially named as regents not John, but a couple of churchmen, one of whom proceeded to die very quickly. John wasn't happy about that. And he had named Arthur as his heir. But on his deathbed, when Richard was dying, Richard only lived to be about 40. They all died relatively young. he actually then named John his heir because Arthur was too young. And one of the things that also you see in some of Shakespeare's history plays is one thing you do not want is a minor on the throne, because a minor on the throne means regents, people acting for that kid, and that means regents have the real power. So just in case people are wondering kind of what, and then Arthur went back and forth and was really, kind of, one would have to feel sorry for him. He was handed around a lot, and he finally did again raise in arms against his uncle John and was taken prisoner in Normandy, and then first at Château de la Falaise and then in Rouen, and then he disappeared somehow. So probably somehow John who did that. Much like Richard III and the Princes in the Tower, Arthur is John's little prince in that way. So at any rate, just in case that helps. And I think that's kind of it for us in terms of what we have to say about both the historical figure and the play. So I guess if there are questions, we're going to see if we can. Oh, well, thank you very much. People are just saying thank you, and I love the movie The Lion in Winter. How true is the telling of this story?
In The Lion in Winter, there was never a Christmas like that in Chillon in 1183.
But certainly the dynamics, the terrible dynamics within the family, really. That's true. You wouldn't have wanted to be part of that family, I think. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for the. Why did Richard go on the Crusades and not want the throne? That's a really good question. I'll take that. There were a couple of reasons. First of all, England was not actually that important. It certainly did not have the status that it had, let's say, by the apex of Elizabeth's reign. You wanted it because why wouldn't you want it? It's right there. It's got resources, etc. But it did not have particular prestige at the time. This fantasy of winning back the Holy Land from Islam was seen to be every Christian king's, that was supposed to be the thing with which he was obsessed. If you could do that, you would go to heaven when you died, you would be guaranteed legendary status. That was going to make you. So it was easy enough to keep people, keep England going. I'll be back eventually. And you wanted to go in the Crusades because that's where the glory was, really.
And in a way, it does fall into the tradition of courtly love, Oh, yes, of course, my darling, I adore you, and I will die for you. Meanwhile, I think I'd better go away for 10 years and fight the Saracens. That seems to be part
of. That's how our relationship is going to last.
That's part of. You've got to keep your distance. I learned that from my parents. Says Richard. It's like, Dad just had to keep away from Mom. I see another question here about truth and pragmatism, and how that might be asking me how that might be playing out today. Well, I think we see several ways in which it's playing out. One is that we recognize that we produce things like institutions of government, law, and so forth, and that they are there really as something that have to, of course, evolve and change over time. They have to respond to the needs of the people, but they're also there as a kind of, in a sense, a kind of limit, right? That is, you may do this, but you may not do that. You can do as much of this as you like, but you can't go any farther than this, that sort of thing. And what happens is when institutions start to be undermined from within, rendered corrupt from within, the result is one of the things that starts to lose its own claims to legitimacy is the truth. That is, its claims to legitimacy as law. That is, if you break the law, it isn't enough simply to say, oh, well, I just changed the law, so it's not a law anymore. I can just go ahead and do it. When we're in that kind of giddy, arbitrary, utterly self-interested, corrupt relationship to institutions, truth is going to be a casualty. And that, in a sense, is not something that simply affects the truth. It affects all of us, and it is, of course, dangerous.
Yes, that's true. Somebody, Francesca Benedict, points out quite rightly, crusades also allowed them to keep their armies occupied as they went on pilfering along the way. And of course, the whole notion of what to do, especially at certain times, with if you had a population with a lot of men, especially youngish men, and not a lot to do with them, take them off to war. It was one of the kind of crude ways of keeping them occupied, dealing with the surplus of them, etc. And of course, it gave people the chance to get, rich by robbing others on the way. That's awesome. Oh, I see. Walter Bradley here is. Yes, we're going to miss the McMaster seminar in July as well. We really enjoy that. We are going to be. I think we're going to be moderating an online discussion group, and also I believe I will be talking on Taming of the Shrew. And the kind of online things that they'll be setting up on the 8th and 9th of July, if that compensates at all. But yes, we're going to miss that this year too. Ellen McLeod is asking, how popular was the play at the time? Are there any famous quotations from it? Why is it so rarely seen? Well, again, that's something that it's something that's one of the slight mysteries about it, because we don't know exactly when it was written, and we don't really have a published version of it before the first folio, which was after Shakespeare's time. I guess we can conclude, shall we say, that it doesn't seem to have been necessarily as popular as some of his other plays. But again, we know that there was quite famous production in 1730, which was obviously well after Shakespeare's time, and there were quite a few productions of it in the late 19th century. And I think that probably part of the reason it's rarely produced now is that it does. I think part of it is that the central character is such an odd figure. You'll really have to kind of look at it to see if you feel this way, or if what I'm saying makes any sense to you on this head. But there isn't a compelling figure like Richard III, for example, this Machiavellian kind of creature. Or it's in a way a bigger mystery to me why Richard II isn't produced much. It's another of the history plays that's not much produced. But it's kind of it's a combination of the play itself being a bit odd and problematic when you see it, and things that we just don't know about. We don't know a great deal about the reception history.
And in terms of famous quotation, the only thing I can think of offhand is elbow room.
Yes, there's elbow room. There are a couple of other less the usual kinds of Shakespearean quotations that we're used to hearing, and just more terms that we are now familiar with, and they're going out of my head at the moment. But Ellen, I would be glad. I know that there are a couple, and they're just kind of at the back of my mind right now. I'd be glad to pass that on to you after I can write to David and tell him those if you care to. Now, there's another one from Suzanne Hill. You didn't mention much about John's wife. Did she play a minimal role less than his mother? In fact, she doesn't appear at all. You don't even know that John is married or has any children until literally he's dying. But this is one of the odd things that, here's the guy who becomes Henry III. Well, where have you been all this time? John actually was married a couple of times, and he had two wives named Isabel or Isabella, which must have been convenient anyway. He didn't have to, learn a second name. His first marriage lasted about 10 years and then was annulled, which is again another, talk about the kind of, what would you say, Dallas or Dynasty-like, the kind of soap opera machinations of this. John and his whole family has it in spades. But he did have a good many children by his marriages, and again, two women named Isabella, neither of whom appears in the play at all, for some reason. Another odd thing about the play.
No, they're apart from, of course there is Blanche, but apart from, Constance, Eleanor, and yes, Lady Falconbridge. Lady Falconbridge in really one scene. Yeah. That's it. Yet, strangely, women are dominating the logic of the proceedings. And
did in the historical context, Constance and Eleanor had a lot to say and do. They were very powerful and very strong-willed women. And Blanche is really there just because she was John's niece. One of his sisters, one of Henry and Eleanor's daughters, was Queen of Castile. And so she's there as a niece to provide a marriage alliance that doesn't actually end up helping much.
No.
So, you know.
Kel and Allan, before we close things up, I just wanted to give people the heads up that if you want to access the video for the King John from Stratford, if you go into the chat right now, I have a link for you and you can get it there. But also the reminder emails from Zoom, the details and the URL is available there. So just in case people are looking for that and how to access the Stratford production, that's where you'll find it. So yeah, just in your Zoom reminder email.
And if anybody does have further questions that they want to ask us, please just let David know that, and he will contact us. We're happy to do that.
Of course, happy to.
Well, I think that's it for today. So I want to first of all thank both Kel and Allan so much for doing this today. This was fantastic, and yes, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us. And yeah, I think it's safe to close it out. And yeah, we will. If you have any questions, we will do our best to get that answered for you. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and yeah, go check out King John on YouTube there from Stratford.
Thank you very much to everybody. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Yes, thank you so much.